STEM 12 for Core 1 relates to the specific priority areas that have been identified, and you can see them here. They're found under the dot point entitled High Levels of Preventable Chronic Disease, Injury and Mental Health Problems, and these are the 6 actual priority areas listed. If you think back to 2 dot points ago, which was the Identifying Priority Health Issues dot point, this criteria here is what is used. So these 5 things are what are actually used to identify these 6 areas. So obviously if these 6 areas did not meet that criteria, or all aspects of that criteria, then they would not be here as identified priority areas by the government. Okay, so this is where this dot point relates back to the Identifying Priority Health Issues dot point, and we've discussed that in class, but you need to be able to make the link, because sometimes you'll be asked a question on this dot point, on the Identifying Priority Health Issues, and you will need to relate it to some information from this particular dot point. But just focusing on the dot point at hand, if we just go to the PowerPoint now, you can see, like I said, there is 6 actual areas listed: CVD, cancer, diabetes, respiratory disease, injury and mental health problems. What we will be doing, if we look over here, we will need to research and analyse cardiovascular disease, cancer and one other condition, and the other condition we will do will be respiratory disease. So what we need to do is we need to actually break it up into 5 different areas, and you can see these areas listed here in the Learn 2 part of the syllabus. So we're going to look at the nature of the problem, the extent of the problem, risk factors and protective factors, the actual determinants, and the groups at risk. So I'll walk you through the cardiovascular disease situation. So obviously in your books we've drawn up our matrix table. We will do that for the 3 priority areas that we are going to do, and you then place the following information into the columns. The first one here, when we look at nature of the problem, so basically we're saying, when we talk about nature, we're just saying what is it. You need to know what cardiovascular disease is, and you can see here there's actually 3 different types of cardiovascular of diseases that make up the broader group of cardiovascular disease, and you'll need to read through that. Familiarise yourself with the term atherosclerosis, which is where you get a build-up of fatty tissues or fat deposits in the arteries, and also arteriosclerosis, which is where the arteries harden. And obviously the disadvantage with arteries hardening means they can't expand, which means when extra blood needs to get through, e.g. in times of exercise or when the body's under stress, they can't get extra blood or more blood through because they are hardening, they can't expand. So this is just a basic intro to what cardiovascular disease is. So whenever you see the nature of the problem, that just means what is it. Moving on to section 2, the extent of the problem, and in particular the trends. Just a couple of statistics here. It is the leading killer. It's the second leading cause of disease, but it's the actual leading killer across all age groups. People are more at risk from cardiovascular disease as they get older. That's what we mean here by saying the death rate increases sharply with age. As far as trends go, mortality rates are decreasing. There's more people surviving heart attacks and various forms of cardiovascular disease than there used to be. This is due to a number of factors, the main one being medical technology. We have the ability to operate on people and save people's lives due to good technology. Also now people are more aware of risk factors or indicators that they may be on the way to a serious cardiovascular disease, so they get regular checkups or more regular checkups by the doctor. So cardiovascular disease is getting sort of diagnosed a bit earlier and therefore treated. And also, as a point of interest, the incidence of cardiovascular disease is decreasing, which is a positive sign. Part 3, we're looking at risk factors and preventative factors. So before we actually get into these, when we talk about risk factors, they are factors that put someone at risk to contracting a particular condition. And when we talk about preventative factors, they are things that a person can do to try and prevent this condition from occurring. So if we talk about it in the context of cardiovascular disease, you can see here with the risk factors, we've broken them up into non-modifiable and modifiable risk factors. So obviously non-modifiable you can't change, and modifiable risk factors are things that can be changed. What you need to do, I'm not going to read through each of these for you, you can do that yourself, but what you need to be able to do is relate, not just know that smoking is a risk factor, but just you need to know how smoking makes it a risk factor, or how smoking is a risk factor. Why is being overweight and obese a risk factor? And you can see here there's a little, sorry about that, there's a little spiel there on being overweight and obese and what it actually does to the heart and lungs and why that puts you at risk of cardiovascular disease. Alright, so in your notes on your table you can just write down the list, the risk factors, but you need to know when you're doing your study the link between the risk factor and the actual disease. Okay, so you need to be able to make that connection. I've also included on PM Online for this Core 1 the actual chapter where I've got this information from. It's not from your actual textbook, it's from another textbook. So I recommend you have a look at that. That can be found up the top part of the module. So these are the risk factors. Over the page will be the protective factors, which will hopefully prevent disease. And again, it's pretty common sense to say what you need to do to prevent them, to come up with these protective factors. So if you can think of risk factors, we'll just go back to that slide, and you've got smoking as a risk factor, then clearly one of the protective factors is going to be to quit smoking. If being overweight and obese is a factor, which it is, a risk factor, then it makes sense to say, well, you need to have a healthy diet, you need to be physically active, and you need to achieve and maintain a healthy weight. I mean, it's common sense. So if you can come up with risk factors, you can certainly come up with protective factors, because the protective factors are basically saying do the opposite of the risk factors. So that's common sense. So there's a very close relationship there between the protective factors and the risk factors. With the determinants, you can see here, these are some of the determinants for cardiovascular disease, but if you just cast your mind back to the last dot point that we did, I'll just come out of this presentation and go back to the syllabus. The last dot point we did was actual groups experiencing health inequities, and one of the things that we researched was the actual socio-cultural, socio-economic and environmental determinants that were affecting these particular population groups. Now, those exact same determinants are the same things that are causing these diseases. Alright, so you can just recap on these determinants when you're actually making your notes for this particular STEM. Okay, we're not talking about anything different. The determinants are the exact same sort of things that cause the diseases in those particular population groups. Okay, but what we're looking at them here is in the context of the diseases. So if you're ever stuck for some, now we've got a list here of some, but if you're ever stuck for determinants, just refer back to your notes on those groups experiencing inequities, because it's those exact same determinants that cause these diseases. So here's some of the determinants, and you can read through those, and you'll make notes on them. And lastly, we've got groups at risk of cardiovascular disease. All right, and again, there is a very strong link here between groups at risk, and if we just go back a few slides, and risk factors. So groups at risk and risk factors are very closely related. So once again, if age is a risk factor, then a group at risk will be the elderly. If smoking is a risk factor, then people who smoke will be a group at risk. If heredity is a risk factor, then people with a family history of cardiovascular disease will be a group at risk. So if we just go back to our groups at risk, you can see here we've got those with a family history of CVD as a group at risk, smokers as a group at risk, people aged 65 years or older as a group at risk. Right, so that's cardiovascular disease. Like I said, we'll also be doing cancer and respiratory disease, and we'll discuss those more in class. But just going back to the actual syllabus, looking at these priority issues, which are these 6 things, you need to make sure for each of the 3, so like I said, we're doing CVD, cancer and respiratory disease. You need to make sure you know what it is, what are the trends, what are some statistics relating to that particular condition, what are the risk factors for that condition and the protective factors, what are the determinants for that condition, and also what are the groups at risk. And like I've said, there is a very strong correlation between risk factors and groups at risk, and also between risk factors and protective factors. Okay, and again, if you're ever stuck for these determinants, just cast your mind back to this dot point and you've got the exact same thing here, the exact same wording, the exact same determinants.